Can everyone see the presentation?
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, cool. So, oops. My name is Jack Pacconi. I'm the second affirmative speaker at Montgomery Bell Academy. And today I'm going to be talking about how to answer Ks, mostly from the affirmative perspective. Now, from what I've heard, a lot of y'all debaters are critical debaters, i.e. you like to read K arguments. This lecture is important, not only if you read policy asks, you have to answer Ks, but also if you like to defend Ks, because you want to be able to anticipate how AF teams will answer your arguments so you can better prepare your own speeches. Now, a general overview for this lecture, we're going to start with framework arguments, interpretations, internal links, impacts, the ways negatives will deploy framework and how to answer those. Then we'll go to talk about topic links that almost every K on this topic will deploy. And then we'll talk about 3 different AF angles that you can use against a K, and then some generic tips. First, framework, the counterinterp. There should be 2 main components of this. First, you want to say that you should be able to weigh the affirmative. By what I mean by this is the 1AC has read a bunch of impacts that you say are bad and the affirmative solves. You should be able to weigh the impact of the 1AC against the impact of the links. The second component is that links of Ks must be to the plan. What I mean by this is not the representations, the epistemology behind the plan, not random quotes in the 1AC, but the actual fiated implications of the plan. That should be what your generic counterinterp is. Now, there's a couple internal links to the impacts. The first is more predicated on links, and the second is more predicated on weighing AF offense. The first one is predictability. Plan focus is the only resolutional grounding for debates. What this means is that when we prepare for debates before the season, we prepare based off of what the plan does. We don't prepare based off of the representations in our 1AC cards, the epistemology behind how we came to the conclusion that our impact causes extinction. That's what we prepared for. There's an infinite number of things that we can say are wrong with the 1AC, but the best of them are to what the plan actually does, and which is the best internal link to the stuff about why links must be the plan. The second one is AF ground. This is an argument that you most often hear is called mooting the 1AC. This argument is that when Ks say you have to evaluate some prior question before you weigh the AF, what this is really code for is you do not get to weigh the AF. That is bad because the AF never has offense and they're forced to play defense against all these infinite possible criticisms of the 1AC, which is a very hard spot for the AF to win debates in because they don't really have offense. And as you probably know, offense is how you win debates. Now, you might be asking, what is the impact of this? There's 2 of them, but before we go dive into them, the secret is that they're both really internal links to each other. Fairness is an internal link to clash, because fair debate makes us have more clash. Clash is a internal link to fairness because when we have a predictable locus of clash, it's more of a fair debate. So when you decide what impact to go for, you should be more so thinking about what your judge is predisposed to voting for. I think it is strategic for the 2AC to have both a component of clash and fairness, and then be able to pivot in the 1AR based off the block. So fairness. The thesis of fairness is debate is the game. There's no educational value to debate absent a fair game. Equal chance of victory is what incentivizes us to cut arguments. It's what incentivizes us to try to research the K because we have a ulterior motive to win debates because it is a competitive activity. The second impact is clash. This is the idea that we need to be able to negate and refute the ideas that the other team says. This has more of a defense of debate being a good thing insofar as the iterative process of debate and research can shape the way we think, but singular rounds do not. So those are the 2 impacts. I suggest having a component of both in your 2AC. So some generic defense to K team arguments. First, you do not exclude Ks. In fact, you probably make K debating better because you force Ks to contextualize their links to plans, which makes us better advocates in real life because we can point to specific policies that are happening on Capitol Hill or in our state legislators and be able to point out reasons why those specific policies are bad rather than just the rhetoric behind those policies. This answers a lot of the arguments that K teams will make that you exclude Ks, you make debate an unsafe space. What you want to say is we do not exclude Ks. We just force you to rebut the specific implications of the plan and then be able to weigh that against the AF. The second component of this argument is if you're so right about the K, you should be able to disprove the AF and just win on presumption. If you cannot do that, then the K is probably wrong, which forces you to better advocate for your position, which has like the benefits as us being able to organize movements, rallies, and stuff outside of debate, which is a reason why debate spills out under your model. The second main argument is debate does not shape our subjectivity. There's multiple alternative causes in our lives outside debate, such as our religion, where we are geographically located, people in the South have different views than people in the North, what schools we go to, what our political views are, etc., all have a more larger impact on the way we view the world than individual debate rounds. The second reason why debate doesn't shape our subjectivity is that we switch sides. One round, we might be defending DDEV and Spark, which we obviously do not believe are good ideas. And the next round, we can be saying that we should improve water infrastructure. Obviously, we do not believe everything we say, or otherwise, like K teams, every time they lose to framework, would come to the conclusion that framework is just true. Or every time you win the politics dissad, you would start believing the politics dissad is true and that PC is real, when obviously it is not. The third reason is we have different rounds. This is the same thing, I guess, above that I said about like we go for different arguments that we don't believe are true. And the last component is we all have different varying responses to losses. I think Joe talked about this a little bit in his lecture yesterday about how when you lose the round and or have a bad tournament, you can have different responses. You can become really depressed, you can become angry. Some people may even come to the conclusion that they lost the round because they were technically not proficient, that they dropped an argument on the flow, and that is why they lost. People that come to that conclusion are not going to change their worldview about how the world operates because they thought they dropped something on the flow. And that is the reason why they lost, not because their worldview is wrong. The last argument is if debate is a game, debaters will not change the way we think because of a round. We will double down and try to beat K teams more. This is why when people lose debates, they try to improve their blocks. They try to cut more cards to answer arguments because they're not going to change their worldview. They just want to win debates. So the last argument is more so compatible with fairness and clash. So I wouldn't make that argument if you're going more of the clash route. And also these arguments should be done in the 1AR in response to the next framework offense. So before we move on to talking about the common types of frameworks that neg teams will make, does anyone have any questions?
So you said this should be in response to like framework, but my question is like, doesn't the app have framework too? Like, isn't this like?
Yeah, this is right now we're talking about the AF side of framework, and we're about to go into the next side.
For like the framework on like the previous slide, would that be in the 2AC?
Previous slide,
Like,
yes.
Okay.
And then in the 1AR, I would suggest either picking clash or picking fairness, depending more on your judge or how the block handles each on the flow.
Is it like possible to extend both or no?
It certainly is possible, but I would advise against it because the conclusion of, or the idea of fairness is that debate doesn't really shape the way we view the world. Clash more so agrees that debate, the iterative process of debates, i.e. having multiple rounds in researching and over the course of a season, we will change the way we think because we're forced to research. And those kind of contradict each other.
Okay, thank you.
Isn't clash and fairness like the same thing? Like they're
Yeah,
both-
that's kind of what I said at the beginning of the slide, that they're really internal links to each other. And the internal links on the previous slide, both of these are internal links to fairness and clash. So that's why it's like more so judge dependent about which one you go for.
And where does education fit in?
Education, I would not make as an argument for fairness, but I would make it as an argument for clash, i.e. when debates center on the plan, we can have a more in-depth debate over the plan's merits and how that is actualized, which has educational benefits, such as making us better advocates because we can indict specific policies and it makes us better defend our positions. I would not ever say debate has educational benefits with fairness, unless you're saying that fair debate makes us research the K more, because debaters will try to beat the K. So in that sense, we will research, like say I lose a round to Heidegger, I will research Heidegger so I can beat it. And that way I become more familiar with Heidegger and it has a greater chance of changing the way I think. Any other questions?
Yeah. So why does it matter if debate like shapes our subjectivity? Like how does that interact with their framework? Or like assuming that their framework is just like way ontology, like why does it matter if debates changes our subjectivity?
I think most of the best offense that K teams frameworks will have, which we'll talk about in a second, are based in some sense about education, i.e. Fiat bad Ks will say that we should shift away from traditional policymaking frameworks and instead so focus on the way that we can actualize micro-political action or something that is more focused in debate because we can't shape the real world. And as a form of education, that is about how we shape our political orientation. Representation ontology case will say that investigating representation in ontology produce educational benefits that focusing on the plan do not. And positional competition type frameworks will say that focusing on the political core of the 1AC produces more education. So most cases have some sort of education impact about how their framework will shape the way we view the world. Anything else? Oh,
A quick note on like the K thing. If K say like fiat is bad, how do they get access to their alt? If their alt's like
that's a very good point. Most K teams, when they go for fiat bad, link to fiat bad. Because when we say fiat, we don't mean like the plan magically being passed. Fiat is a question of the resolution says the word should, i.e. that the government should do something. We are not asking about whether or not that would happen. We are imagining a world in which such a thing did happen and debating about whether or not that would be a good thing. K teams, when they say fiat bad, link to their criticisms of fiat for two reasons. One, they say a world in which we have fiated the plan would be bad and we should not do it. Second, they say a world in which we fiat the alternative, or in a world in which the alternative should be done, it would be a good thing. That's a good point.
so like if you were Nick, like what would be your answer to that? Like, so like they were saying like fiat bad, but like they obviously have like no clear access to their alt. Unless their alt like reject fiat.
I think the best answer, the negative, will be fiat is different. And so your offense will be more so focused on fiating government action is bad because it makes us think the state is good and stuff like that. It'll be more about the actor of fiat. And then a lot of times they'll have offense based off of the actor of the alternative being good, such as like teams that would read the Rodriguez race K would make arguments about why macro political action is good, i.e. saying the state should do something is bad, not good, bad. And then they would say micro political action, i.e. focusing on what we can do inside of debate is good. So it's more so a question of actor than the process of just fiat.
Okay, so isn't that just like state bad again?
I guess, yeah. Okay, yeah. Okay. Does anyone have any questions about AF framework stuff? Okay, cool. So talk about the neg stuff now. First neg type of framework is the fiat bad stuff, is what we just talked about. They'll make arguments about why traditional policy frameworks are bad and why plan focus is bad because of all the things we just talked about. I'm not going to delve that deep into this because I mostly just hash this out. The second type of framework is prior questions. This takes the form as saying things like, quote, they can weigh the AF, but they have to defend their representations in epistemology. When the 2NC stands up and say this, you should not be like, oh crap, they've said we got to weigh their AF. This is a fake olive branch. They do not actually think you get to weigh the 1AC because the conclusion of this framework is if they win a link to the affirmative in your representations, your epistemology, your ontology, whatever, then you do not get to weigh the AF. This culminates in a model of debate where the negative wins a link, then the affirmative team automatically loses. That is bad for fairness reasons because it rigs the game for the negative. And second, for clash reasons, because these models of debates are unpredictable because there's an infinite number of representations in the 1AC, an infinite number of epistemologies, there's an infinite number of quotes they can pull from the 1AC that are unpredictable. Most of the links that the negative team will read under this type of framework are not to the plan. They'll be saying the way you've come to the conclusion that your impact causes extinction is bad because it's based in logic of science and objectivity, which is bad, stuff like that. They'll often pull quotes from the 1AC, which you should say are unpredictable, and they'll focus on, their offense will be more so focused on why the educational benefits of talking about representation epistemology are bad. Your top level answer to this is you can indict our representations in epistemology, but they should be done so in context of the fiated implications of the plan. What this means is representations in epistemology are a byproduct of the consequences of our action. Like saying that the plan should be done because it prevents warming is not in and of itself a reason the plan is bad. We should determine whether or not those representations in epistemology of warming being a bad thing are real based on whether or not the affirmative actually solves warming. If the 1AC is a byproduct of its fiat implication, solves warming and it prevents extinction, then that is a reason why our representations in epistemology are a good thing. This is often good for AF teams because neg teams don't really like to go for case defense in the 2NR because a lot of times they just don't have time to. So you should leverage the fact that they have not contested the validity of the 1AC's claims to prove your representations epistemology are good. Okay, last type of framework is positional competition. This is less common, but it kind of made a resurgence at the Michigan camp, so I'm going to talk about it a little bit. This is the idea that they get to weigh their case against the alternative, but if the 1AC carries forth an ideological commitment contrary to the alt, you should reject the perm on severance grounds. So the way this first came into existence was there was an AF that said that had a hedge advantage that was like, we should have a resurgence of American leadership in the international order because that is good. This neg team read a counterplan that advocated for offshore balancing, which is something different than hegemony, and then said that it is competitive because the 1AC has said that hedge is good and the counterplan says hedge is bad. And then it basically forces an impact turn debate. You'll most commonly see this in things like the CapK, where they'll be like, if we win, the 1AC carries forth an ideological commitment towards capitalism and the alternative fiats of movement that ends capitalism, any permutation would be illogical. Think of this like the anarchy counterplan. The reason why perm do both doesn't make sense against the anarchy counterplan is because you cannot pass a government action and also devolve the government. So this framework isn't that good because it says you get to weigh the AF, and you have two kind of options when you're AF against this. One, go for perm do both. Like the alternative in these debates will be something massive that most assuredly will overcome the links to the plan. This is just like, this framework shell is just a convoluted way of saying the AF and the K are mutually exclusive. The second option you have is to say, fine, we get to weigh the AF. I'm not going for the perm, but I'm going to either debate cap good or like the impact turn for 5 minutes, or I'm going to say the alternative does not solve anything and the AF does. Okay, so before we move on to topic links, does anyone have questions about how to answer these specific framework types from the AF perspective.
So like, does the neg have to like have their alt? Like, does the neg have to say that the links make the alt impossible, or do they just have to say that the links make the alt like, I don't know, 1% less likely?
I don't really know. That's more of a Joe type question. I think when the K team say links or disads, they would say, oh,
So like, you said like the alt probably can overcome the links because the links are like links of omission, right? But the isn't can't they just make the argument that the links make the alt just the tiniest bit less improbable?
I think what you're referring to is that the alt provides uniqueness for the link arguments, i.e., if the links are to the status quo, but also to the AF, and the AF says that the links are non-unique, then the neg should say the links still make the alt competitive with the affirmative, and the alt provides uniqueness for the link arguments.
I
I
think a
hope
good
that answers your question.
I think a good example of what Joe just said is Michigan put out an AF that was a dams AF that had its solvency mechanism was cap and trade, which is essentially saying that we should construct markets to solve the woes with dams. Cap K that stands up and is saying and says that the AF fiats a market is created, and then the alternative fiats that markets are destroyed. Those two things are obviously not compatible, and any permutation would sever the 1AC's commitment towards constructing markets because the alternative would destroy markets. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. My question then is like, what does it mean for an alt to provide uniqueness to the AF?
Joe?
I don't think it's like uniqueness for the AF. I think it's just uniqueness for the link argument. So the example that Jack just said was like the like alt destroys all markets. Obviously, markets exist in the SQO, but the cap and trade AF, it creates a new cap and trade market, which is a reason why the alt and provides uniqueness for the link argument that the AF creates a new market and that new market is bad, even if the links are saying all markets are bad.
Okay, now that makes like so much more sense. So like, even if they're links to the status quo, it provides new uniqueness because like you boost up the status quo, like even by like a fraction of a percent.
Yep.
Okay.
Cool. Okay, now we're going to talk about topic links that like every K will read. The first one will be called something like environmental managerialism, calculative thought. The thesis of this link is that the AF attempts to manage or control the environment to solve a problem in the world. This will take the form as the AF protects water resources in order to solve something like global warming. And that is bad because it creates a relationship with nature that is antithetical to the intrinsic value of nature and focuses more so on how we can take nature and repurpose it towards something that helps humans, which is bad. There's a couple of common answers to this. One, this is inevitable. In cross-sects of the 1NC, you should ask something like, does the alternative solve the impacts? If the alt solves the impacts, then it most assuredly is engaging in some form of calculative thought or environmental managerialism, especially if they have like an environment impact to the K. This is especially prominent in something like a Heidegger K. If they say no, the alt does not solve the impacts, then obviously the alt, there's no reason to vote negative because they don't have a reason why the alt solves the impacts. And then it's just basically a linear disad to the AF, and all you have to win is the AF outweighs, which is a pretty good situation to be in if you're AF. Other arguments why this is inevitable is in round, we engage in decisions that are calculative, i.e. we spread so we can say more words per minute, make more arguments. That is calculative. We also pick and choose arguments to extend based off of how the 2AC responded, etc., which all prove the negative is engaging in calculative thought, which this in debate stuff is especially important on framework. Another common example is a lot of case defense will engage in some form of calculative thought. Like when they read a card that says biodiversity does not cause extinction, they are using scientific modeling and data to come to a conclusion that the biodiversity is not bad, which proves that they're engaging in some form of objectivity and scientific thinking. A second common argument is that it is good to manage the environment if our impacts are true. Like how we talked about versus prior question type frameworks, you should say our representations are a byproduct of the consequences of the plan. If they do not if the negative does not contest the 1AC impacts and the solvency of the 1AC, you have to presume that managing the environment prevents some form of extinction or some form of impact that is good if you win your impact calc arguments that extinction must come first or what other impacts you have. That should be your top level answer to it before you say it's inevitable. You should be like, calculative thought is good because it prevents extinction. Third argument is objectivity/science is key to solve problems, especially oppression. So like, say you're debating a Heidegger K that's like the calculative thought creates a standing reserve where everyone becomes ontologically dead because we end frame the environment towards human purposes, which is bad. You should say that if we do not agree that there's some form of objectivity and calculative thought in the world, then it's impossible to align with the press. Like, ask some questions. Did the Holocaust happen? Obviously, yes, it did happen. If we do not believe that there's some form of objective truth in the world, then it is impossible to come to that conclusion. And you need to be able to know the truth in order to side with the press, which is a reason why objectivity accesses and interlink to the K. You can also make arguments about why objectivity in science is good to navigate the Anthropocene, solve warming, biodiversity, all sorts of other impacts. It's also key to stop like authoritarianism, which is bad because if we don't know the truth, then it creates like propaganda and echo chambers, which is bad. Yeah, the fourth argument is just impact defense. The impact to like environmental managerialism bad will most often be like some form of environmental impacts or some like rogue tech type impacts. And you can just say those things don't cause extinction, which means that the app should just outweigh. Next link is called masking/green capitalism. The thesis of this argument is that the app solves one issue, but masks the root cause of environmental destruction, which makes the USFG look like a savior. It washes our hands clean. It makes us think we've done our job. We can all go home because we've solved all the woes in the world. There's a couple of app answers. One, proximate causes. Obviously, there are multiple things that result in environmental destruction or other impacts, but the affirmative resolves one of them that we've came to the conclusion that is causing like warming, which means you don't have to solve everything that could possibly cause an impact, but if you sufficiently solve something that you've outlined will cause the impact, then you solve it. Second, saying the state should do something is not synonymous with saying the state is good. Demanding the state does something is in fact critical of state inaction, because the reason why the plan is good is because the state has not done it. If we say that the state should protect the environment, establish MPAs, something of the sort, you are critical that the state has not done so yet. This makes us come to the conclusion that the state is being bad now and that we should demand the state does something. This is, in fact, a tactic that a lot of movements use. Think of abolitionists who were critical of the fact that the state had enslaved people and demanded that the state emancipated people. This was not saying that the state was good and that we should align with the state, but rather we are mad at the state and they need to do so. Same thing for civil rights era. They were mad about Jim Crow and all those other things, and they demanded that they were abolished. So it is possible to ask the state does something without saying the state is good. Second to last link is viewing water as a resource versus as an intrinsic good. This will sometimes be aligned with the environmental managerialism type links and objectivity links that were on the first link slide. The thesis of this link is that the app does not value nature as nature, only its use as a resource. The AF answer to this, you should just be shrewd. Be like, nature doesn't have value outside of the animals and people that compose nature. The real bad things about environmental destruction is that it causes pain and suffering towards human and animals. Death is an impact, but nature itself is not sentient, nor is it alive. It cannot feel the effects of environmental destruction because it does not have neurons. It does not have biological functionings to feel pain because it's not sentient. You should honestly just be like, who cares? This believing that we should value nature as an intrinsic good over the suffering of humans and animals leads to perverse impacts, such as valuing a bunch of rocks over people. There's actually a brand of philosophy called object-oriented ontology. And there's this one philosopher that did an experiment where he was like, I'm going to put a sticker on everything that is valuable. And he believed that everything in the world was valuable, whether or not it was living. So he came to the conundrum where he was like, I have to put stickers on top of stickers indefinitely because everything is valuable inherently, which is like illogical because you can't keep putting stickers on top of stickers. So like, it's silly to value something that is not sentient over the suffering of human and animals. Last link is apocalyptic rhetoric. The thesis of this argument is that the AF securitizes their impacts using crisis rhetoric, which leads to bad decision making. This will commonly be seen as like security K type arguments. There's three main AF answers to this. One, it links to the K. The reason why security rhetoric is bad is quite often something that is a terminal impact that causes extinction or some sort, such as endless interventions, environmental destruction, which are things that are also securitized by the K and linked to them. Second, it is good to securitize impacts because it leads to extinction. As we said before, the representations of securitizing the environment is good if the consequence of the plan is that it solves extinction. The alternative would say we should not securitize the environment or whatever the impacts on YC is, which is bad because it leads to quietism and inaction. We will never solve problems if we come to the conclusion that solving problems is securitizing it and is bad. Third, and we're gonna skip that. That argument's not that good. Okay, does anyone have questions about the common links before we talk about AF angles versus the K?
Oh, can you go back to that slide for a sec?
Maddie, to answer your question, I don't think K teams often want to defend the status quo. Like, the most common instance in which a K team will win that the app doesn't solve their impacts is in which they win a link turns the case argument, or in which they win a root cause claim, in which it is helpful in that debate to have an alternative that would either solve that root cause or would do something to solve the link turn. I don't know if Joseph has anything to add to that.
Usually it's unstrategic for a lot of critical teams to defend the SQO, given that a lot of critiques have a framing issue about how evaluating certain things in the SQO is bad, and that the AF continues that paradigm. So usually it's at least they have an argument about how to differently evaluate the SQO.
On the subjectivity thing, why would the neg say like, so one, what does subjectivity mean? I think I have a pretty good definition, but I like you guys. And two, why would the neg say subjectivity is bad?
Subjectivity is the way that we orient ourselves politically and ethically towards the world. Like an example of which is like people have different political subjectivities which they align with right views, centrist views, liberal views, and even further left views. The negative will not normally say that subjectivity in and of itself as a concept is bad, but the subjectivity in which the affirmative produces is bad. An example of which will be like a security K that's like you produce a subjectivity in which we securitize impacts in order to solve them. which is bad. I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, so it's like, so subjectivity, is it like synonymous with like the decisions we make?
Kinda. It's the quality of being based on or influenced by personal feelings, tastes, or opinions.
Okay, so it's like what we base our decisions off of. And
Yeah.
they're saying what we base our decisions off of is like bad. But like, so if they're
Yeah.
not saying subjectivity all in it of itself is bad, then why would like how would they link? Because like you said, like, oh, they make decisions, they like spread and they choose different arguments. If they're not saying all of subjectivity is bad, how would they link to their own argument?
I think in the example here where I was talking about calculative thought being inevitable is less so about subjectivity, but the way in which we try to solve problems. Something like Heidegger will say that we should not engage in calculative thought, which is like using nature to solve problems for humans, but rather we should engage in meditative thought, which is like value nature for nature being intrinsically good. So like in round, when they're being calculative, it proves that their framework does not change the way we subjectively think to reject calculative thought, because they're still engaging in it.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay. So AF angles versus K. There's 3 of them. I would suggest the middle one, but we'll go through each of them. First is a permutation argument, which is saying that we can do the alternative and the AF at the same time, plus a link turn argument. This most commonly is run with AFs that are more soft left and don't have big giant impacts because they cannot win that the AF normally outweighs the K, but they can often win that the end point of the affirmative and the alternative are not mutually exclusive, and in fact could be both done at the same time. In this debate, you want to more heavily debate the links than you would in the other 2 options, because if they win a link, it is a reason why the permutation most normally isn't compatible. The second type of AF strategy is AF outweighs plus alt fails. This will most commonly be run with big stick AFs that say the AF solves extinction or something like that. And then they'll win impact calc arguments about why extinction should be prioritized. And then the most common neg angles versus will be arguments about the root cause of the impacts or something that the AF doesn't solve, but the alt does. In this scenario, you want to prove that the alt does not solve anything. If it's like a movement, you want to say movements are cracked down by the state, corporations. If it's a violent movement, you want to say that the state has F-16s and tanks. They'll just like straight up murk these movements. You want to also make arguments about why, if these movements do not engage the political in any point, then it does not actually lead to actualizing change, stuff like that. In this type of debate, you don't really need to answer the links as much, because there's not really going to ever be a scenario in which the full weight of the link will outweigh the impacts of the affirmative. Something also in these debates is you really want to leverage the fact when they do not contest the case that it proves all of their links are link turns, because they'll say the things the AF does is bad, and you want to say they're good because the AF solves something that like extinction that outweighs the K. The last type of angle versus the K is just straight up impact turning. You don't care about the links. You don't really care about framework, because if framework is you don't really get to weigh the AF, and we get links to stuff, and they get links to things that say, like, for example, you help capitalism, you can be like, fine, we help capitalism, capitalism's good. Out of all these strategies, I'd recommend the middle one. I think it's just most easy to win, and it gives the neg less offense and spots them less. Does anyone have questions about these 3 AF strategies before we talk about general tips? No? Okay. General tips. In the 2AC, something that a lot of 2As do not do that I think they should is every single card that the neg reads in the 1NC has a purpose. They're not just throwing out cards there for no reason. And your 2AC on the K, you should line by line every card. You should be like, the Warren card says X, but Y. The Wilderson card says X, but Y. You should go through every single card because, and like, if you know a card is going to be a link, you should give that card a name of the link. You should be one step ahead of the negative in the 2AC. Second thing I would suggest doing is reading theory versus K teams. If they say they can kick the alternative, you should say, no, they don't. Condo's bad. If they say the alternative is a movement, you should say fiating a movement is bad. It's impossible for the AF to generate a solvency deficit or some sort of solvency differential between a government policy and a transnational movement. You should also make arguments about why something that is more of a discursive alternative that like fiat's an epistemic mindset shift is bad because it's impossible to generate solvency deficits again to something that literally fiat's a change in the way we think. And the way the negative will either respond to this sometimes will prove your framework offense because they might accidentally slip up and say something like negative flex, key to engage the affirmative, key to fairness, which you can just concede and be like, fine, they get their alt, but it proves our framework offense. They also may just blow off theory and be like, we don't link to this. In that case, if they're like, we don't link to movement fiat, the alt is just like some discursive thing, then you can make solvency deficits about why just discursive action is insufficient to solve the problems in the links that they've outlined. It's also just like a time suck. The block has to answer it or else it's like auto lose. Third thing I'd recommend is when you do impact calculus arguments like extinction outweighs, do it on case. Something I often do is I'll be doing line by line on case, and like after I answer a case defense argument where they're like the impact doesn't cause extinction, then after I answer the card I'll be like extinction outweighs, and I'll do it like on case because a lot of times K teams in the block will either not touch the case page or they're not really flowing the case page, so it's just like you can cross apply it if they don't really answer it in depthly. And something often two NCs will normally not get to the case page. They'll just do it on the flow and they'll do it in the 1R and it's more time pressed. So you're normally ahead on the warrants of that stuff. Fourth general tip I suggest is you should preserve all three strategies if possible in the 2AC, i.e. you should be able to go for a permutation in a link turn. You should be able to go for AF outweighs, framework, and alt doesn't solve anything. And you should also be able to go for an impact turn. Obviously, this is not possible in every single K debate. Like you can't impact turn anti-blackness. Like no one ever does that. But like if it's like a cap K debate, you can obviously make a perm argument, AF outweighs argument. You can say cap good. And you should do that because then it gives the 1AR options to choose which strategy to go for. Fifth thing I would suggest is when you answer link arguments, you should do so offensively. What I mean by this is you should not, your first answer to the link argument should not be the AF is not X. Your first answer should be the AF is Y. Don't talk about what the AF is not, talk about what the AF is. If they say the AF engages in calculative thought, you're never going to win that the AF does not engage in calculative thought. Obviously do. You want to say we engage in calculative thought, which is good because it prevents extinction. Your first answer should not be something defensive, but rather offensive, something that makes you not sound like you're being defensive, but rather making arguments that could potentially win you debates. Rather than making link defense first, make link turns. You should obviously, after you do that, make link defense, but always forefront offense before defense. Last tip, cross-X is super important in K debates. If you don't know what's going on, cross-X when you find out. If you don't know what links are to the AF coming out of the 1NC, you should ask them. If you don't know what the alternative does, you can find out in cross-X. If you want to figure out what theory arguments you can make it in cross-X. If you want to figure out in the 1NC if they're going to be more of a fiat bad type K or a prior question type K or a philosophical competition type K, you can find out in cross-X. So those are my general tips. We have some extra time, so I'm going to talk about extinction outweighs because it's important. Something that teams do often is they say util. Don't say util. Just say extinction outweighs. Util is more of a philosophical maxim that's like we should do the greatest good for the greatest number of people, which leads to more perverse outcomes that are easier to critique than just saying extinction outweighs, because we can all agree that we should not allow humanity to be exterminated, but that does not mean we should defend the philosophical maximum of utilitarianism. A couple of arguments in support of this is just scope. The sheer amount of people that would die in an extinction event is astronomically large. There's 7 billion people on the planet currently. There's trillions of people that could come into existence as future generations, that under a magnitude times probability risk calculus, you should just win the extinction outweighs. Second is extinction is irreversible. Once humanity goes away, it never comes back. This not only is just something that's inherently bad, it also precludes the potential for the alternative to be enacted, which is good because if you preserve humanity's existence for a little bit of time, humanity can live to fight another day, and it gives the potential for the alternatives to be enacted in the future by future generations. Third argument is suffering. Extinction is not a painless experience. It is something that would be really painful. Nuclear war, for example, would cause people to go blind as they look at the blast. It would cause their teeth to fall out, their livers would fail, their kidneys would literally deteriorate. It would be a slow, painful process. Not only would it be painful, it would disproportionately target vulnerable populations. In nuclear warfare, people that live near military bases are more so people of lower socioeconomical classes, and they'd be the most likely to be targeted in nuclear radiation. They'd be the first to die, which turns okay. Something that I would say in the context of this is the reason why the K's impacts is bad is essentially that it avoids some form of preventable suffering, i.e. racism is bad because it causes suffering and it can be prevented. Nuclear war or extinction acts as preventable suffering at a much larger magnitude and scale. Last argument is agency. Death should be a choice. We should not force death upon people. If we have the opportunity to enact the affirmative and we win that doing so would prevent extinction, we should do so. Otherwise, voting negative would sentence trillions of future people and billions of current people to non-consensual death, which is just immoral. We have 10 minutes. That's all I have. If anyone has any more questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
So like for soft left apps, should we still go for alt fails in like cap good or whatever?
Maybe not. I mean, maybe you could say it depends what your 1AC is constructed like. If you make impact calculus in the 1AC, that's like our impact comes before something else. I would not make arguments that are like capitalism solves war. I think you could make arguments that are like if the 1AC makes arguments that capitalism causes environmental destruction, you can probably make arguments that are like capitalism solves environmental destruction in phrases impact defense. You could also probably make arguments that capitalism leads to prosperity, like the quality of life after the Industrial Revolution was much higher. People lived longer. They had better access to healthcare, medicine, food. They lived longer, happier lives than before it. Capitalism gave people access to private property, which is better than feudalism, just like stuff like that. I wouldn't make arguments that are like externally it solves extinction if you're going with like a soft left half.
So like the difference would be like alt. So you're doing an internal link turn instead of like an alt fails claim. Is that the difference?
I think you can do both. I would certainly make arguments that the alternative doesn't solve anything if you're reading a KF, but I think if your end goal is to go for a permutation and a link turn, that should not be the focus of your 2AR. Like alt fails is really strategic when you're going for like an extinction outweighs type scenario, because you want to win that the alternative does not solve a root cause to your impacts, which is maybe a little bit less prominent in soft left apps, but it certainly could still happen. So I would make this arguments in 2AC.
Okay.
Anything else?
All right. Okay. So I'm gonna stop the recording.